3, 2, 1.
Hello, I am Gideon Lichfield. I'm the editor-in-chief of MIT Technology Review, and welcome to another episode of Radio Corona. Today, we are going to be talking about vaccine trials, and we're going to be talking about people who volunteer for vaccine trials and about the idea of volunteering to get the coronavirus in order to test whether the vaccines are working properly. Joining me today are Ian Haydon, who is an information specialist at the University of Washington at Seattle, and he is one of 45 people enrolled in a vaccine trial right now that is being done by Moderna Pharmaceuticals, one of the companies that's developing a vaccine in the United States. Right now, this is just a safety trial. Ian has taken the vaccine, and they're waiting to find out, A, whether it has any side effects, and later they will test him for antibodies to find out whether or not he's developed them. But there's also another idea, which is called a challenge trial, and that is a trial in which people are exposed deliberately to the coronavirus after getting a vaccine, and then they will see whether the vaccine is effective. And so our other guest right now is Josh Morrison, who is one of the founders of One Day Sooner, which is an organization that is recruiting volunteers for challenge trials. A little bit later in the program, we're also going to be joined by Caplan, who is founder of the bioethics division at New York University and who advocated for challenge trials in a recent paper published in the journal Vaccine. So Ian and Josh, thank you both for joining us. It's great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
Good to be here.
So Ian, start off by tell us about the trial you're in and what it's been like so far.
Yeah, so like you mentioned, this is a phase 1 study. It's testing Moderna's experimental RNA coronavirus vaccine, although the study is being run by the NIH. And I feel great. I got my first injection, first of two weeks ago. Actually just went to the clinic today for a follow-up visit, a blood draw, but I feel totally fine. The shot didn't hurt. I haven't suffered any significant symptoms as a result of it. And honestly, I feel just like I did, a month ago before I got the shot.
So tell us a bit about this kind of vaccine. I mean, it's a type of vaccine, an mRNA vaccine that has been tried at least before, right?
That's right. Yeah, my understanding is this is Moderna's 10th candidate vaccine that's been injected in people. They don't have any vaccines that have been licensed. None have been shown to work. It's a new company. It's a new technology. So it's an mRNA vaccine. It's not a brand new idea, but Moderna seems to be the furthest along the pipeline. And the thinking is, every vaccine tries to do the same thing. It's trying to train the body to recognize a problem before you're infected by it. Normally that's done by taking either a virus or a dead version of the virus, or even just a piece of the virus, with maybe one protein from the virus, and injecting that into healthy people so that their immune system can mount a response. What's new here is I have not been injected with any version of the virus or even a protein from the virus. I received some molecules of mRNA that derive from the virus. These little snippets of genetic code for one of the viral proteins. And if this vaccine is working, some of my cells are going to temporarily make this one viral protein. It's the spike protein. And then if all goes well, my immune system will see that, have a response, and create antibodies against that. And hopefully those antibodies will be protective, but we won't know that for quite some time.
Right. And you said Moderna has had some candidate mRNA vaccines for other diseases. So do we already know that in general, these vaccines are at least safe, they don't harm people? Or is that one of the things you're there to find out?
Yeah, so this is a phase 1 study. So the only goal of this study is safety, reactivity, and a little bit of immunogenicity, although efficacy is not the point. They're not looking to see how resistant I become to the virus. They're looking to see how my body tolerates this vaccine. And you're right, Moderna's other candidate vaccines some have gone through phase 1, some are in phase 2. My understanding is that those have not produced significant health complications. They've not made anyone very sick. And preliminary data from many animal experiments, as well as some phase 1 data, does seem to suggest that even relatively low doses of these mRNA vaccines are effective in eliciting antibodies against viruses, for example. It's not known in this trial whether the antibodies will be made, and it's not known whether those antibodies would be protective. That is one of the things that will have to be looked at down the line.
Right. So, I mean, it's great that as a volunteer, you actually work in a medical lab and that you are an information communicator. So you can both understand what's going on and talk about it coherently. I mean, how many of the other volunteers have that kind of background?
I know very little about any of the other volunteers. There's 45 of us in total, although that number actually is going to increase. The trial was modified to now include more older folks as well. So the number will soon be more than 45. But I've not been in contact with any of the other subjects except for 2 who've also outed themselves publicly and declared that they're in this trial. I've spoken to one of them just briefly online, but I don't know their backgrounds. I don't know how they're faring.
Right. And we've been joined by Arthur Caplan from New York University. Hi, Art. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. Art is a professor of bioethics at NYU, and he also is the author of a paper in the journal Vaccine, which talks about challenge trials, and we'll be coming to that question in just a second. So as a reminder, you're watching Radio Corona for MIT Technology Review. If you're watching us on Facebook or YouTube, you can drop questions for any of our panel into the comments, and they will get fed to me, and then I will ask them. So please ask away. So to stick with you, Ian, just for a sec more, this vaccine, as I understand, one of the things that makes this unusual is, if I'm not mistaken, this has not actually been tested on animals, or at least it wasn't tested on animals before being tested in humans. Is that right?
So the timeline is unusual, but it has been tested in animals, not all the way. So my understanding, again, is that for this candidate vaccine, it has gone through the equivalent of phase 1 in animals. There's no evidence that it makes animals sick. But the efficacy studies, the later part where they actually establish whether or not it blocks infection, that wasn't done in rodents. And part of the reason being that the mice that were being subjected to the study, they don't catch coronavirus, the novel coronavirus. So those studies weren't completed. And a decision was made that that efficacy data in animals wasn't needed before safety trials could begin in humans. We've been talking about how this mRNA platform is not new. It's gone through phase 1 trials targeting other diseases before. And I suppose the thinking was just to accelerate the timeline. If we know that it's well tolerated in animals, it might make sense to figure out if it's tolerated in people, even before we know whether or not it's effective, because to wait and learn that it's effective in mice is going to delay by several more months. Before then, you'd need to begin the same safety trials anyway.
Right. So we're potentially saving months by not going all the way with the animal testing. All right, so, and actually I have one question from somebody in the audience who is asking of Ian, would you consider yourself a risk taker? And do your friends and family think you're crazy for doing this?
No, I don't consider myself a risk taker. Even in the context of this trial, I don't have a sense that I'm taking some enormous risk here. I'm not the first person to be injected with an mRNA vaccine. I'm among the first for this candidate vaccine. But my thinking here is that we desperately need a vaccine for this new coronavirus, and we're not going to get one unless healthy people participate in clinical trials. So of course, I'm putting a lot of my trust in our scientific infrastructure in the National Institutes of Health. But it's clear that if healthy people aren't willing to take on this small risk, we're not going to arrive at vaccines. So, I'm not a risk taker. I don't think that my loved ones, my friends, consider what I'm doing here reckless. A lot of my friends are scientists, and truth be told, many of them are actually jealous. I know some of them applied to be in the trial and were looking to get in themselves. So it's been fun chatting with them about it.
Great. Okay, so let's move to talking about the idea of the challenge vaccine. This is the idea that someone might be given a vaccine and then intentionally exposed to the virus in order to see whether or not it's effective. Art, do you want to tell us a little bit about the history of this idea? Because this is not the first time people are trying it, right?
That's true. Challenge studies where you deliberately expose someone to an agent go all the way back to Walter Reed in yellow fever in the development of the Panama Canal. They were getting clobbered. So by yellow fever, it was destroying the workforce. So they deliberately infected themselves voluntarily with mosquito bites and for agents that help combat yellow fever. More recently, you see challenge studies in a variety of areas. For example, pollution. People are exposed to different doses of pollutants and dangerous chemicals to assess their safety. There's no benefit in it for them. They're not going to be made immune or resistant. They're just basically test to subjects to see whether something causes something untoward, and hopefully not death, but something that you can measure biologically and say that's trending toward or indicative of a dangerous impact on the person. Another kind of challenge study, we forget about this, but in the armed forces, if you want to be an astronaut, the challenge studies are off the wall. You might get centrifuged for like 90 minutes and turn into a pancake to see what the effect is of centrifuging you for that long, or having you try to live upside down underwater for 12 minutes. These are to establish physiological facts about what somebody could be tolerate, exposed to, undergo in the kind of conditions that space travel or high altitude flight. At the far extreme, I sometimes say, who the biggest challenge study is? It's the test pilots. They get into a plane for the first time. They hope it takes them where they want to go, but there are a lot of crashes.
Right. So obviously, in the case of astronauts and test pilots, they've signed up already for a pretty high degree of risk. So in medical challenge studies, what are the ethical considerations around whether or not somebody should be asked or offered the opportunity to take that kind of risk? And are there some recent examples of medical, specifically disease studies, where that's happened?
Yeah, well, and way back in probably 25 years ago, in a challenge study at Johns Hopkins, a young woman, Ellen Roche, died. And that certainly is an important
Sorry, this was about a study about asthma, right?
Yes, in trying to induce it. And she had a terrible asthma attack and died, exposed to a chemical, no benefit intended for her. They were just trying to figure out what induced asthma, and it went so bad that she died. That has absolutely thinking about challenge studies since then. Many of my colleagues and peers who I respect would say, look, you cannot just infect somebody with a deadly disease when we have no rescue therapy, right? None of the president's nostrums about anti-malarial drugs or fixing anybody. We can't say, oh, if you get sick, we're going to inject you with this, or you'll take this pill, or this is what we'll do. We can say you're going to go to a ventilator, but the outcomes there are not great, to say the least. So the biggest issue is the risk tolerable at all? Next, can people really choose to do this? Are they doing it voluntarily, without coercion? What we were just talking about before, who's going to sign up to get a test dose of a vaccine and get it challenged by deliberately giving you the disease? It almost sounds like no one could capably and honestly choose to do that.
Right. Okay, Josh, let's turn to you. So you're one of the founders of One Day Sooner, which last I looked at the website, you had about 2,400 volunteers from 52 countries who had signed up to potentially become participants in a challenge trial. Can you tell us a bit about how you got the idea for setting this up and what you're planning to do with all these people who've signed up?
Mm-hmm. So I got the idea, basically, I read an article that ended up being published in the Journal of Infectious Disease by Nir Eyal and Mark Lipsitch and Peter Smith about the idea of doing a challenge trial for COVID-19. And my day job is advocacy and lobbying for living organ donation. And the basic theory there is to give people who are living organ donors, and particularly kidney donors, more of a say in the decisions around the transplant field. And the kidney donation business is quite slow, about 90% drop in living donation rates. So I had some free time, and I live in Brooklyn, so kind of the epicenter, or in New York City, the epicenter of the pandemic in the US. And so I was obviously feeling like pretty kind of depressed and scared and things like that. When I thought about this idea, and I thought about potentially doing this myself, that seemed like something that kind of constructive that maybe I could do and could possibly participate. And I talked to one of my friends who kind of funds, who works at the foundation that funds some of my kidney work, and he put me in touch with Nir Eyal, one of the authors of this paper, and we sort of thought about it, and it seemed to make sense to try to organize potential volunteers for such a trial, basically, same kind of logic as with my kidney donation work. The idea that the ethical discussion around these trials will make more sense and be more, fruitfully well informed by having these volunteers be a part of it. And then, to your question of what's going to happen with people that sign up, I think now we're over probably about 2,600 by this point. As we've had several hundred people sign up just today, which has been incredibly exciting. And our goal is to create kind of the preconditions for if there's broad, try to help create broad public support, so that if vaccine manufacturers want to use human challenge trials, there is like a large and kind of well qualified and enthusiastic population of people all over the world. We have volunteers in I think 52 countries now who would want to participate. So making that kind of as seamless as possible, both from the kind of public discussion side and from the actually running the study side. And I'll also add, we're hoping that our volunteers, whether or not challenge trials move forward, we're hoping that our volunteers can also potentially be useful sources of participants for other studies of these vaccines, much like Ian does, because that's obviously clearly valuable work. And so we hope that can be useful as well. Okay, I'm just going to remind those watching, you can send questions for our panelists via the comments on Facebook or YouTube, or if you're watching on our technologyreview.com website, there's a link to a Google form there and you can throw questions in there. So just coming back to Josh again, you said you had volunteers in 52 countries. How many of them are likely to be able to participate in a coronavirus vaccine trial? Well, it's not clear yet. So basically, historically, there's kind of roughly speaking, two different kinds of challenge trials that you would need to use here. One is there's an infectious dosing trial trying to figure out what the right dose of the virus is to expose people to. Traditionally, that's taken about 40 to 50 participants. And then challenge trials themselves to test efficacy typically are around 100 or maybe a bit more than 100. So my sort of mental model of this is that if we expect there to be, a number of these trials for different, one for kind of multiple different vaccine candidates until we find vaccine candidates that work very well, I would sort of picture, roughly in my head, 1,000 people would end up doing something like this as sort of a rough order of magnitude kind of scale. And then in terms of, I think that, the people that would do this would have to be very healthy and young, probably between something like 20 and 40, possibly something just like 20 to 29, 20 to 30, and not have any comorbidities. And so, we only right now have pretty limited information on our volunteers. We have the reason why they volunteered, their name and location and contact information. But so looking at those reasons why people have volunteered, many people say, I'm young, I'm this age, I'm healthy, it seemed like a good idea. A lot of people also have kind of a medical or public health or biotech sort of background too, and have a little bit of familiarity.
Right. What sort of screening then do you have to do to make sure that people are not volunteering for the wrong reasons? I mean, presumably you don't want people who are, I don't know, maybe you don't want people who are risk takers or who lead a high risk lifestyle. Is that a problem? And how would you do that?
Yeah, so there's a few different things we thought of for this. So, the initial stage we're at right now is just that initial expression of interest. And if you look at our website, which is onedaysooner.org, there's you can, and in the form that people fill out, it says several times this is just one form and one step out of multiple steps, and it's just an initial step, so it's not the final thing. And then I think the next thing we're planning on doing, which we're hoping the survey goes out next week, is an academic anonymous survey of the volunteers to understand what's going on in the volunteer population. Who are these people? What are their motivations? What are their perceptions of risk? How does their moral distancing compare to people in the general population? How does their risk taking and impulsivity compare to the general population? Things like that. And we're working on that with bioethicists like Nir Ayal and Seema Shah, who's an expert in challenge trial bioethics. And we're also working with Abigail Marsh, who's a social psychologist and cognitive neuroscientist who studies prosociality, particularly in kidney donors. So that's kind of that first step to try to get a sense of what this population looked like. We then expect, we have to kind of figure this out, and there's several kind of IRB bioethical kind of approvals and steps we want to do before this, but we would like to do some sort of pre-qualification kind of questionnaire to our volunteer population to sort of actually start sorting people by, who has comorbidities, what are people's levels of enthusiasm, things like that, so that if a challenge trial moves forward and manufacturers are interested, we can present to them a well suited group of volunteers who we think are likely to be able to offer consent freely and be eligible to participate.
Right. Art, I mean, what's your take on the way that One Day Sooner is running, and how important is it to do that kind of screening of people to make sure that they're taking part for the right reasons and under the right conditions? You're muted.
I have to say something that I want to say unmuted. I want to say Josh is, I think, going exactly down the right path, trying to be careful about the competency, stability, physical eligibility to do this work. I think that we do want to use younger subjects, partly because we know the mortality rates are much better if you do get sick for that group than an older group. So it's not that we're trying to sacrifice the young, it's just less risky to go that route. One of the things I've learned, and Josh probably knows this better than anyone on earth, if you're going to have living organ donation, your kidney, a piece of your liver, you usually try to appoint someone to be the advocate of the person who doesn't care if they donate their kidney. Similarly, you could have a donor or a subject advocate in these studies who say, look, I don't care if you enroll or not. I just want to go through the dangers, make sure you understand the risks, make sure you understand that there's no benefit to you. Make sure you understand there may not even be any compensation for you if you get sick or die. And then if you want, I'll give you an excuse to get out of this. I'll say you have a comorbidity. There might be some white lying that goes on. I can imagine someone bragging to their friends, I've signed up, I'm going to do this, I'm going to make a real contribution, and then saying at the last minute, maybe not, I don't really want to do this. You have to give them an out. All that said, I think Josh's plan is right on target. If you will, Ben, let me add one other out-of-the-box idea. I think I can actually jump past even Josh's early planning. I've suggested that maybe what the first group we should try are people who are newly dead, brain dead individuals on life support. You could get consent from a family. We have proposed this research at NYU in a group I'm on, actually to test out replacement devices for organ failure. First in line to try them on would be a newly dead person on a vent. Obviously, we can't do this in a place that's short on vents, but somewhere in the world. And you'd get your initial basic 72-hour adverse event. Is there anything instantly dangerous? And then move to the group that Josh is collecting and representing. It may sound macabre, it may sound strange, but look, it's time to think outside the box to go faster. But I want to protect Josh and his altruistic heroes a little bit. So that may be a model that we could use to at least get an initial reading. And I think people would volunteer for that too.
I have a question that somebody asked about this on Twitter, actually, which is how does doing a challenge trial, in other words, intentionally exposing people, how much does that speed up the process of testing a vaccine as opposed to simply giving a random section of the population a vaccine or placebo and seeing how many of them, how many of each group develop coronavirus infections over a few months' time?
So it's so I think one thing I'm not an expert on vaccines. I just started learning about this stuff a month ago, and so but one thing I have learned is that there's a great deal of kind of uncertainty in the process, and it's very complex. There's a lot of different moving parts. So there's a few different ways that a challenge trial might be able to help. One proposal, the proposal in the Nir paper, is to kind of fully replace a phase 3 with a challenge trial. Now, generally, this isn't unprecedented. The cholera vaccine that American travelers typically get, Vaxchora, was approved on the basis of a challenge trial, which had about 100 people in it, versus a phase 3, which is going to have several thousand or possibly 10,000 or more. And if you look, this wouldn't be typical for coronavirus, but the malaria vaccine, RTS-S, that's being deployed right now in 3 African countries, that was involved in phase 3, but also it used, I think, about 6 different challenge trials before that. And the phase 3, I think, took about 5 years and 15,000 people. And so I think for COVID-19, what it would look like is a phase 3 is going to need to take probably something like at least 6 months. So if you look at, they're studying the tuberculosis vaccine BCG right now. They're doing a phase 3 to see if maybe it would help with coronavirus. And they're doing it in healthcare workers as kind of a high-risk population, which makes a lot of sense. But it's about 5,500 people that they're testing, and it's going to take about 7 months.
So,
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to jump in with one other factor about phase 3 and how long will it take. One of the big limits on vaccines is manufacturing capability and how easy they are to make. So you see some vaccine candidates, they may be very promising, they may work, but it would take 3 years to manufacture them in the millions of doses. So you also have to be thinking, in testing out these vaccines and where do we want speed, is this easy to make or hard to make? And there are ranges of this. I won't go into the details, but if you have one that looks like, hey, we could gin up 1 billion of these in 3 years, that makes it a little different in terms of the risk-benefit assessment. If you said, well, I can make 50,000 of these in 3 years. So there are different limits that way.
And that's exactly right. And that goes to this point of where challenge trials might be useful. So one is it could replace a phase 3, but I think what's more realistic is it might be run sort of alongside a phase 3 or slightly before. And that way you could find out useful data about, is this vaccine likely to be effective? It's imperfect data. The challenge trial population is really young and healthy. And so you're also being infected from an artificial means. It might be difficult to test about whether a vaccine reduces severe illness, which is maybe the way that vaccines might be most important, most effective for coronavirus. So it has real limitations, but that can be a very important signal for the manufacturing process. And that could help get you moving with the manufacturing process, either accelerating manufacturing buildup that's already happening or decelerating manufacturing buildup if it's not looking like it's going to be helpful, by giving you a month or two or even more compared to that kind of typical phase 3 results, even if you're doing both things at the same time.
Right. So Ian, back to you. You're on a vaccine safety trial right now. Would you take on a challenge trial as well when it comes along?
Yeah, so I'm not inclined to do it, but I am not totally opposed. So I'm somewhere in the middle. I want to hear the argument. I think it's an interesting one. And my thinking on this issue, sort of, there's 2 big sections of it. One would be something we've already discussed. Really concretely, what does a challenge trial get you, right? And we just went over that. If it produces a mixed result, does it mean you still have to do a phase 3? What are all the possible outcomes, and what do those mean for a vaccine production timeline? I think that's critical to discuss ahead of time. Then the other would be, speaking as a subject in a vaccine study, and as a molecular biologist myself, I would need to see quite a bit of data actually about myself before going in, right? Do I already have antibodies? At what titer? Are they neutralizing against pseudotyped lentivirus? Like how far along is the data on my own health condition, and how much confidence should that give me, or should that give an impartial scientist about, what risk am I really taking on in this study? So, if those 2 things lined up, if it was clear that a challenge study really could accelerate the timeline, and if there was convincing data, as best as we can tell in a lab, that I may already be immune, those are the kind of conditions in which, the door to doing a challenge trial could open a little bit. But for me, it's largely closed. I would, it would be the job of someone to persuade me otherwise.
Right. So a question then for both, well, for any of you actually, but particularly for Ian and Art. If somebody here is watching and thinking to themselves, I might want to get involved in a challenge trial, and they're not someone who has a molecular biology background or a virology background, what should they weigh up?
Well, it's hard to imagine anybody's watching this without a molecular biology background, but okay. I think I'd be thinking first, am I in the right age group? As Josh pointed out, we do want to push toward younger people. I'm too old to volunteer, too big a risk group. I would have tried to volunteer decades ago, but we're in the right age bracket. What comorbidities do you have? If you vaped, if you had chronic lung disease from some asthma or some underlying condition, it's probably not for you to be doing this. I would say if you're thinking about this too, you want to ask, am I doing this out of any sense of guilt or somehow trying to make good on something? It's not that those motives are bad, but you want to make sure that you hear the risks clearly, that there's danger, there's no benefit. There might not even be a heck of a lot of reward if the thing didn't work. People just say, well, that wasted, your time, your life, your health for nothing. People sometimes say, I've done a lot of bad in my life. I want to do something good for once. And again, nothing ignoble about that, but maybe it's distorting your ability to hear. And then I'd say something funny just from personal experience. Again, Josh will laugh, with living donation. Make sure your spouse and your partner's okay with it too. There's nothing like coming home and saying, hey, I'm going to volunteer for the challenge study that's super risky. And your spouse says, you do know we have 4 kids and I'd like to have an income. So maybe not you.
And I'd also add to that, one piece that's not necessarily easy to appreciate is that people who participate in the challenge study are going to be isolated in like a medical, or I sort of think it as like a government facility for a significant period of time, probably at least a month. So that's also, an inconvenience and that is very relevant for if you have a family and different things like that. That's relevant to consider before people decide to move forward with it.
Right. We're going to wrap up in a minute. So if you're watching and you have any last minute questions, please drop them into the chat, into the comments. I want to ask Art about an idea that has come out recently from some Israeli researchers, which is the idea of something called a controlled avalanche. This is apparently taken from a technique they use in ski resorts to prevent large avalanches. They set off small controlled avalanches. The idea here is that you intentionally expose groups of young, healthy people who are unlikely to die from the virus, intentionally expose them so that more of them develop immunity more quickly. What do you think of this idea?
Well, I like, again, thinking outside the box, and desperate times, we need some desperate measures, but I don't think this is a good idea. I don't think it's a good idea until we get some other facts filled in. Like, if you are exposed, are you still shedding virus even though you're not symptomatic, even though you're healthy? You don't want to have large numbers of people wandering around infecting everybody else, some of whom may be less protected, if you will. You also have reinfection issues, which you don't know about this virus. It's in the cold family, it's coronavirus. Everybody watching and all of us talking here know that you can get colds again and again and again in a season. And is that a slightly different mutated virus? Is it the same one that comes back? It'd be nice to know that before we ran out and infected significant numbers of folks. The other danger is, I don't know if it ever happens in the avalanche studies that they do with avalanches, but there is a chance you could set the whole thing off anyway if you ran 4 or 5 groups, and the next thing you know, you've made an avalanche. So I'm not against it in principle. I just think it's going to take filling in more blanks before you'd know if you could really do it with large numbers of people without really causing some significant danger. Remember, the challenge studies we're talking about, they're really not big numbers of people. Even Josh may have thousands of volunteers, tens of thousands soon enough, but you could probably get what you needed in the early phases of this with like 50 people. You don't really have to. We could then argue about the phase 3s and how that would proceed and so on, but at least initially not big numbers. The avalanche thing the Israelis were talking about, these are big numbers.
Right. Final question for Ian. How long is the trial that you're enrolled in? How much longer is it going to take before you know the results?
Yeah, so the phase 1 trial is scheduled for 14 months and it will last that long no matter what. That's the time that they're going to be monitoring my health. They're going to be analyzing it in real time, is my understanding. And I've heard from Fauci actually in his press briefings that we could know the results of safety in less time than that. In as little as 3 months is what he said. So somewhere between 3 and 12, the researchers will have some sense of whether this thing is still a candidate for phase 2.
Right. And Josh, how long do you think it is before we start seeing the first challenge trials?
Well, I think it still remains to be seen whether they're going to be practical for COVID-19. There's definitely, like I mentioned, some limitations of challenge trials in terms of having a representative population and being able to study severe disease. So there's a very real world in which, these are interesting options and options that are worth pursuing. But one other sort of obstacle to their being utilized, and this kind of is sort of interesting as it pushes the other way, is that it takes time to set challenge trials up. There's sort of two main steps that need to happen first. You need to have what's called good manufacturing practices, or GMP, for the virus itself, and that you're going to use in humans. And then you need to do the infectious dosing trial that I mentioned before to get the right dose. Each of those steps takes a few months, kind of varies what people's estimates are and things like that. And so, I think what we want to be doing is we need to be taking those steps now, especially the GMP, which is the first piece of it, so that if it looks like challenge trials are going to be a good option, we're able to use them ideally for that first wave of candidates, which, if things go well, hopefully we'll be having phase 3 trials starting this fall, sort of best case scenario. So I think that from a timeline perspective for challenge trials, I think we can sort of hope, if things are looking promising for them, to have a infectious dosing trial that in about 40 or so people starting, sometime late this summer, about 2 or 3 months from now, and but might take a little bit longer than that, and then have the challenge trials ideally ready in early fall to try to catch those first wave of candidates. But there's significant uncertainty around it, and so right now we should think of challenge trials as a good potential option, an option that needs to be explored and needs to be explored immediately. We need to sort of start getting the steps into motion, but we shouldn't think of it as, oh, this is a clear solution that's definitely going to work and that there are no questions about.
Right. Good. Well, I think we're out of time, but thank you very much, Art and Josh and Ian, for joining us. If you're watching on the stream, thank you for joining us too. The transcript and the video of this episode will be up on our website just as soon as we've got them ready. And you can come back and check on technologyreview.com for future episodes of Radio Corona. See you then. Bye.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining us.